Today we're going to talk about the safest carbohydrate in the world. I want you to do an experiment. I want you to get a piece of bread, which is not necessarily sweet, and I want you to take a bite and start chewing it. What you're going to notice within 20 seconds, it's going to go from not being sweet to being very, very sweet, almost like you're chewing on sugar. Now, what's really interesting is this bread has no sugar in it, but it turns into sugar from the enzymes in your mouth that break down what's in that bread. I want to share some fascinating things about carbohydrates and make it really simple so there's no more confusion, because there are so many people that don't know what I'm going to share with you. There's all these foods out there that are carbohydrates that actually have no sugar. And so sometimes people think, oh wow, those are okay to eat. So today I'm going to share some very fascinating things related to the carbohydrate. And I'm also going to explain why some people seem to get away with eating any carb that's available. Other people cannot get away with it. In fact, their body breaks down. So the first thing you need to know is a carbohydrate is not one thing. It's three things. You have either a sugar, a starch, or a fiber. Most people know what sugar is. And then what's a starch? A starch is just sugar packaged in a different way. So a starch is a chain of sugar molecules. And then we have something called fiber. Our bodies cannot digest fiber, but we feed the microbes in our gut the fiber. But the fiber does not turn into sugar. So out of all of these, which one is the safest, okay? And also which one's the dangerous one? Let's get into the most dangerous one first. Remember I said that certain people can tolerate and get away with any carbohydrates and other people can't? It really boils down to this one hormone called insulin right here. If someone has a healthy system with insulin and it's able to process the blood sugar correctly, they don't seem to have a problem. Because what happens when you consume carbohydrates, the blood sugar goes up and then insulin comes in there and clears out the glucose from the blood. In a person with unhealthy insulin, the term for that is insulin resistance, they can't lose weight. So in other words, when they eat carbohydrates and insulin goes up, they don't burn fat anymore. They retain salt. They develop a fatty liver. They eventually develop type 2 diabetes. They get high blood pressure. They develop belly fat. Their nervous system is more in the flight or fight mode, so they're kind of stuck in stress. People with insulin resistance do not tolerate carbohydrates that well. What causes insulin resistance? The chronic consumption of either refined starches or refined sugars. Now let's introduce you to another concept called the glycemic index. This is basically an index that represents how fast carbohydrates will spike your blood sugar. So the glycemic index kind of revolves around a score 100, okay? And that's pure glucose. Regular table sugar, it's actually 65. It's not even 100. So it's actually much lower than you might think. Bread is higher. It's like 75. So remember what a starch is, right? It's a string of glucose molecules. And what determines how fast the blood sugar spikes has to do with what they do to the starch. Because there are certain starches that they put through a chemical process to alter the starch. And they might add heat. They might grind it into a powder. A lot of them are maybe like 135 or maybe 125, not way up here, but some are very, very high. Because if we look at something really high industrial starch like maltodextrin, which is a highly refined powder that they put in a lot of foods, versus down here, wheat kernels. Like in order to make bread, you'd have to grind it down the flour. But if you actually take the wheat kernels, these little berries, and you soak them and you eat them, that has a glycemic index of 41. That's pretty low. Even if you have this whole barley, it's like pure barley, it's at 28, very low on the glycemic index. Or even steel cut oats are at 52. But the big question is, who's going to consume this stuff down here? They don't. They consume things much higher on the scale. Other things influence insulin too. How much muscle that you have. Your muscle is a sink or a backup to hold a lot of this dietary glucose that you consume. And this is why even bodybuilders can get away with carbo loading, because they have so much muscle to hold all this sugar. And then if they're working out, doing weight training, guess what? The contraction of the muscle will burn the sugar. But then let's take a look at someone who's sedentary, okay? Someone that doesn't exercise. within a week of bed rest, like you could start developing insulin resistance. It happens that fast. So a lot of people ask me, what supplements do I recommend? Now, of course, I'm not biased of my own high quality supplement line, but if you go to Amazon and type Dr. Berg supplements, you'll find more information. Then you have sleep. Even a couple nights of insomnia can start to affect the receptors for insulin and make the insulin receptors less sensitive. And then the same goes with stress and also fructose. And I'm mainly talking about fructose in its pure form, which is not natural, but a tremendous amount of people are drinking isolated fructose in the form of high fructose corn syrup, which is devastating on insulin, okay? Not directly, but indirectly from the liver. It can cause insulin resistance pretty darn quick. And number 6 is belly fat. Once you have visceral fat or fat on your liver, it becomes a new engine or a machine that generates more insulin resistance on its own. And this is why a lot of times you can't just give up carbs and fix insulin resistance. You have to work on all of these factors and give it some time, because usually it takes 10 to 20 years for a person to develop insulin resistance and then prediabetes and diabetes and all of these things right here. I have a free download that I want to give to you. This free download is my daily routine in a checklist. This is a routine that I use every day to feel like I'm 18 years old, even though I'm 60 years old, and I want to give it to you for free. And so there's a little link down below. Click it and definitely download that. So this is why it's so important when you go to the doctor, insist that you get a fasting insulin test, and you want that number to be below 5. All right, now let's go further down the glycemic index and get down to something called non-starchy vegetables, okay, which just happen to be the safest carbohydrates in the world, and I'm going to explain why. Take a look at broccoli. Broccoli on the glycemic index is basically a 1. Non-starchy vegetables don't have a lot of sugar, but believe it or not, a lot of these starches, rice, potatoes, and grains, don't have a tremendous amount of sugar. They have a huge amount of starch, but actually a moderate amount of sugar. But remember, the starch is a sugar. It's just packaged in a certain way. So the big difference between these non-starchy vegetables and these other starches is basically these have less starch. I mean, just tiny amounts of starch and a lot of fiber. And the cool thing about fiber is fiber does not affect insulin. Now, the ironic thing about non-starchy vegetables is that they contain things to help you reverse insulin resistance, okay? So here we have carbohydrates that can help heal you versus carbohydrates that actually create more disease. So what are in these vegetables that can help you with insulin resistance? Well, the microbes eat them and turn them into what's called short-chain fatty acids, which basically increase this other compound, GLP-1, which actually reduces your appetite and it can help you lose weight. These vegetables also contain phytonutrients, one being sulforaphane, that can also help you make insulin more sensitive. There's many others as well. And then also these vegetables are loaded with magnesium and potassium, 2 key minerals to support healthy insulin function. And now that you know the safest carbohydrate in the world, you have to see my other video on the most dangerous carbohydrate in the world. And I'm going to put that right here. Check it out.